Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, author and comedian Andrew Doyle on how Labour's plans for an Islamophobia definition could bring a blasphemy law to Britain.
If you start saying that people have a protected characteristic because of their belief system, as opposed to race, gender, sexuality, and all those other protected characteristics, then inevitably you're going to be introducing a kind of secular blasphemy law.
Pseudonymous Substacker Eugyppius on Germany's recent state elections and how the rise of the AfD is upending the politics of migration in Europe.
In many ways, the cordon sanitaire is already in collapse in Thüringen. AfD is so strong that the other parties will have serious problem forming any kind of government there.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with journalist Ben Pyle on David Lammy's claim that Britain's biggest foreign policy threat is climate change, and the Foreign Secretary's bizarre endorsement of ethnic cleansing.
It was a double whammy of a week for Lammy, this sort of ham-fisted, somewhat oafish, clownish figure. But these are people who are sort of seemingly punching above their weight on the global stage, trying to set an international agenda.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Islamophobia is the accusation that's often on the lips of woke activists, levelled at everyone from Boris Johnson to Trevor Phillips to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. But it's a notoriously broad and nebulous term. Back in 2018, the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims defined it thus, quote, Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. The previous Conservative government refused to implement that definition. As one minister put it earlier this year, in this country there is freedom of religion and also freedom to criticise a religion. But Labour has long backed the APPG definition and is now, of course, in power. So, Sir Keir Starmer may be an atheist, but is his party about to introduce a blasphemy law by the back door? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to welcome to The Sceptic Andrew Doyle, comedian, host of Free Speech Nation, and the author of several books, including Free Speech and Why It Matters and The New Puritans. Welcome to The Sceptic, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Andrew, you've written recently for us on Labour's ongoing plans to potentially bring forward their definition of Islamophobia. Now, what is that definition and what are their possible plans?
Well, at the moment, it's a bit hazy as to what definition the Labour Party will actually embrace when it comes to legislation. It is very likely, however, that they will go for the all-party parliamentary group's definition of Islamophobia. That was the definition that has been agreed on through this cross-party group since a few years now. 2018, that's how they described their proposed definition back in 2018. And of course, you'll already see what's wrong with that definition, insofar as it's factually wrong. Islam is not a race; it cannot possibly be. It is a belief system. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world and they are from various ethnicities. It's simply not a race. So the idea of calling Islamophobia a kind of racism and specifically saying that it targets expressions of Muslimness, whatever that means, is a kind of linguistic trick. What this effectively does is it will conflate what we should be calling really anti-Muslim prejudice or anti-Muslim hatred, whatever, something like that. You know, the kind of people who throw bacon at a mosque or physically attack people because they are wearing Islamic attire, all of which, of course, is a completely different thing to the criticism of a belief system. In a free society, as you will, I'm sure, agree, every belief system, be it religious or political or ideological or whatever it might be, has to be open to criticism and ridicule. And Islam, of course, should not be ring-fenced from that, because to do that would be to patronize Muslims, to effectively treat Muslim citizens as second class, to say that they need special protections, that they can't be criticized or treated in the way that everyone else is treated. So if the Labour Party does, in fact, adopt this definition, then that spells a lot of danger for free speech. I mean, vandalism of mosques, physical attacks on Muslims, all of that stuff, harassment of Muslims for being Muslim, all of that is already illegal. So there's no real purpose. There can be no other purpose to the criminalization of Islamophobia other than the criminalization of criticism of the belief system. I can't see what else it could potentially be.
Okay, and so one way people have characterized this is essentially as a blasphemy law. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When you start saying that you can't criticize certain religions, then it is tantamount to blasphemy. It's quite interesting to note that this particular definition of Islamophobia was the one that was demanded by the group The Muslim Vote. This was a group that put 18 demands to Keir Starmer to say that, you won't get the Muslim vote back until you acquiesce to our demands. And this was, of course, because of what's going on in Gaza and what they perceived to be Labour's failure to tackle what was happening over there and to call for a ceasefire unequivocally. And of course, yes, absolutely. When Muslim groups are demanding protection from criticism, yes, I mean, I don't see how else we could describe that other than as a blasphemy law. And there's a really interesting confusion going on here, which we saw in the Scottish hate crime bill as well, which is if you start saying that people are part of have a protected characteristic because of their belief system, because of Islam, for example, as opposed to race, gender, sexuality, and all those other protected characteristics, then inevitably you're going to be introducing a kind of secular blasphemy law. You're saying, not so much that you've got to follow certain beliefs, but that you can't criticize others. And I think that should worry everyone, including Muslims. I think Muslims should be particularly worried about that. I think anyone of faith will tell you, anyone of genuine, authentic faith will tell you that their faith is not shaken or should not be shaken by criticism or ridicule. And if it is, the faith is probably on very weak ground to begin with. So I think the Labour Party should, if they have a commitment to free speech, which I'm not sure that they do, should completely ditch this idea. I mean, it would be one thing if they were focusing on the violence against Muslims, which, as I say, is already illegal. But that's never what Islamophobia means. I mean, to give you an example of how that word, I mean, let's not forget, by the way, that the word Islamophobia was really popularized in the 1970s by Iranian Islamic fundamentalists. It was a deliberate ploy to prevent people from criticizing their faith. That was why they were propagating this idea. That's why they've turned it into a phobia, into a fear, into something that is pathologized. They're saying it's beyond the pale. If they would have just come along and sort of said, we need to outlaw criticisms of Islam, well, a government can't just put that through. But if you couch it in this term Islamophobia, which was based on a modification of xenophobia, but also has connotations of homophobia, transphobia, and all the other million different phobias that exist out there, it's linguistic sleight of hand. That's what's happening there. But to give you an example of the dangers of applying the term Islamophobia to anyone, we could consider what happened when the Southern Poverty Law Centre decided that Majid Nawaz and Ayaan Hirsi Ali should be added to their list of anti-Muslim extremists. And even though Ayaan Hirsi Ali, of course, was born a Muslim, she's no longer a Muslim, she's a Christian now, but in Islamic terms, she's an apostate. And Majid Nawaz, when they accused Majid Nawaz of this, he was a practicing Muslim, but he was just critical of the more extremist elements within Islam. And in the end, Majid Nawaz sued them for over $3 million successfully. So, but the reason why he did so is not because it made his fundraising more difficult with Quilliam, which was the foundation he was working with at the time, but also because it paints a kind of target on one's back. There are extremists out there. We know what happened with Charlie Hebdo, with the beheading of Samuel Paty, Lee Rigby in this country. We know that there are Islamic extremists who occupy most of the time of the security services in this country. So to label someone Islamophobic actually has ramifications which are troublesome, to say the least. I don't think the government should be outlawing any form of speech. I mean, they're busy doing that all over the place. But in this, it's very, very clear to me that they're playing with fire, and they really should stop.
Okay, now we'll get a little bit more into that question of this concept of a phobia in a second, but I just want to return to this question of how this definition interacts with what's fair to say the ongoing upsurge of Muslim identity politics in Britain. Because, of course, what this definition does is it conflates a religion and a race, and sort of in this way kind of casts all Muslims as this kind of ethno-cultural bloc. And would you say that this in itself partly fuels the rise of Muslim identity politics in Britain?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it won't have escaped many people's attention that this kind of tactic comes straight out of the woke playbook. And I think there's something very shrewd about Muslim community leaders adopting this approach and playing the identity politics card, because at the moment we're enthralled to a government that is obsessed with identity politics. I mean, the left in the UK and in America have completely lost their way and moved away from class consciousness and those kind of economic issues, and have turned to cultural issues, and now believe above all else in group identity as the sort of prevailing creed. And that will include, of course, that is the modern form of identity politics. So it doesn't surprise me, because that's a very successful method. And so, of course, Islamic community leaders will adopt a similar method because it works. And you might want to make a comparison with what happened at the Batley Grammar School. You'll know about this in West Yorkshire, where a teacher had shown images of the Prophet Muhammad, images that had caused offence and led to the massacre at the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine in Paris, in a discussion about free speech, so completely relevant to the lesson. And rather than defend the teacher, the school and the unions condemned the teacher. There were death threats against the teacher. As far as I'm aware, that's over 3 years ago now. The teacher is still in hiding as a result of that. There were mobs of Muslim protesters outside of the school. And what they did is they used the lexicon of the woke. They started saying that the safety of the children had been endangered by this use of language. That's straight out of that playbook, to say that you are made unsafe by words. We have a similar thing when there was a child at a school who brought in a copy of the Quran and accidentally scuffed it. And this resulted in this child being slapped with a non-crime hate incident, being investigated by police, meetings going on, all sorts of fuss over absolutely nothing. It was a copy of a book that he owned. That book only has a sacred value if you believe in it. Most people don't. So, and again, the idea of involving the police, of weaponizing identity politics, is pretty much what every activist group does at the moment. It's certainly what the trans activists do. If you've seen a number of gender critical feminists being hounded, frankly, by the police because of their legally protected beliefs. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that there are certain Muslim activists who will do precisely the same thing. And I'm sure there's a lot of Muslims who recognize that this is appalling behavior and don't support it at all. The problem is that many high-profile ones understand that it is a strategy that works given the current culture war that the government is waging.
And to move on to this concept of Islamophobia and other kinds of phobias, I think one of the things you were saying there is that there's almost these words almost sort of pathologize certain ideas or ways of thinking. And actually, if you take a different example, if you take, say, homophobia, for instance, and as you mentioned in your article, you might have a religious reason, say, for opposing gay marriage or another reason. And that doesn't mean you necessarily irrationally hate gay people. That might just be your belief, right? But this concept of homophobia, or these phobias, present all such disagreement as sort of some kind of a mental pathology almost. And how damaging do you think that is for debate?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of issues there. I mean, the homophobia example is a good one. There's a lot of people who oppose same-sex marriage, including, by the way, gay people. I mean, we've got to remember that when it was first mooted, a number of gay activist groups opposed it on the grounds that it's a heteronormative institution and that gay people had always been outside of that. And this was seeking to normalize them within that heterosexual framework. So there's all sorts of reasons to oppose it. There's religious reasons, as you say. And, you know, there are people who do genuinely hate and find appalling and disgusting gay people. And they... well, I mean, let's just say as well that they should have the right to feel that way. You know, I mean, we can have this discussion about what qualifies as hatred and what qualifies as legitimate criticism, but can't we go back to the point that actually human beings should have the right to hate? It's a human emotion. It is built into us. I'm not saying it's a positive quality, but it's still there. We don't have the law trying to clamp down on other negative qualities like envy. That doesn't happen, or sloth or something like that. So that can, but yes, absolutely deliberate strategy, making it a phobia to criticize a belief system, even though we don't have Christianophobia, for instance. We don't have Marxistophobia. We don't have phobias of other belief systems. Maybe we should invent them too. I guess that would be quite a good tactic. But it effectively pathologizes opinions such as forcing women to wear the veil, or the veil in of itself, a burqa, a niqab, that these things are, these forms of attire are at root misogynistic. They're an expression of a misogynistic idea, which is that women are responsible for any sexual attraction that their appearance generates, not men. So of course it's based on misogyny, and of course it keeps women in subjugation and makes them second-class citizens in all of the major Islamic theocracies. However, if you say that in the West, you are often accused of being an Islamophobe, which would make all of the feminist Iranian protesters who are throwing their veils off, burning them, dancing in the streets, all the brave women in Afghanistan singing and posting images of themselves singing online in defiance of the Taliban, that would make all of these women Islamophobic. And I think this points to another problem, which is that when we talk about Islamophobia and Islam more generally, and the Muslim community, we tend to homogenize them in the way that the identitarians within their ranks are trying to do. It means that we're trying to see them all as one block. This is very misleading. More often than not, what is happening is that Western activists are siding with the most reactionary elements within Islam. They're siding with the men who want to run Sharia courts. There are a number of Sharia courts in the UK, which of course should be abolished because we can't have parallel legal systems, but they're there, and it doesn't even appear to be on the table that we should have a conversation about the abolition of Sharia courts. It means they're siding with those men. It means they're siding with the imams. They're siding with the men who want to beat their wives, who want to force women not to be able to travel without their husband's consent. It's a very Western-centric view. It could encapsulate all sorts of people. It could encapsulate people on the left. Yasmin Alabai-Brown, who's a Guardian columnist, wrote a book about the veil, criticizing it, pointing out that it's misogynistic, pointing out that women have been desperate to rid themselves of this garment. In Iran, before the revolution, if you look at photographs of women, they are dressed like Westerners in the way that they choose. They can wear whatever they want. And then as soon as that changed, they're veiled. They're against their will. There's a really good animated film called Persepolis, which is all about the struggle of women post the Iranian Revolution. So I think Western activists, and I think particularly intersectional activists, and I think this is the problem, is that leftist thought has become infected by intersectionality, which means that they can only think in terms of hierarchies of privilege and oppression. And within those terms, Muslims, for whatever reason, are pretty high up what has been called the oppression Olympics. It means that you to criticize Islamic regimes, in a sense, makes you a bigot, which represents a serious problem for leftists, because of course a lot of Islamic regimes are themselves bigoted. They certainly hate gay people, and I use that word correctly, I think, because they want to legislate and have them executed, or indeed, in the case of Iran, for instance, to force gay men into sex changes, or at least to deeply encourage them to do so in order to see them heterosexualized. So as I say, I suppose my fundamental point here is that Islamophobia is playing into the hands of the most reactionary, backward, unreconstructed, patriarchal elements of ultra-conservative Islam, and yet it's being cheered on by people who claim to be on the left. I find that bizarre.
Okay, so a one-time value of the left was obviously free speech, but Labour in particular don't seem to care very much for this anymore, and that's across multiple domains. But in particular, they're scrapping, or pausing technically, but with a view to scrap, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which is done by Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary. And now partly they gave a sort of practical reason for this. Maybe you'd say it's a cynical reason, but just there was things like, we need to safeguard our income from Chinese students and stuff like that. But actually one of the more shocking briefings they gave about it, which was their sort of real reason, was, and I'll quote it, in fact, "We make no apology for pausing the Tories' hate speech charter," which is an extraordinarily dismissive way of putting it. And you'd think that at least there'll be some kind of concession to the value of free speech there. But why is Labour so dismissive to free speech?
Well, it's partly to do with the authoritarian instinct, which isn't specific to the left. I mean, that it's an instinct that resides in human nature generally, irrespective of your political affiliation. I've seen it emerge on the right quite recently as well. But certainly the Labour Party and the leading figures within the Labour Party are at heart authoritarians. They don't believe in free speech. They're absolutely clear about this. They don't believe in press freedom. They believe that the only way to sort of cultivate a successful society is to control the speech and thought of citizens as best they can and to limit the parameters of acceptable ideas. So that doesn't surprise me. Also, though, that quotation from someone within Bridget Phillipson's circle would suggest to me that Phillipson doesn't understand the issues. I don't think she has the first idea of what she's talking about, and evidently has not made an effort to understand the issues. I mean, you see this often with Labour, particularly with the gender issue. You know, they haven't sat down with LGB Alliance or people like Rosie Duffield. Keir Starmer hasn't even met with Rosie Duffield, in spite of the fact that Rosie Duffield wasn't able to go to the party conference because of threats against her person. Why he hasn't apologised, I've absolutely no idea. But the only people that appear to have understood that issue is people like Wes Streeting, who has said he's going to implement the caste review. But what you find is not only a complete ignorance about the issue, but an unwillingness to enlighten themselves. What Bridget Phillipson should be doing is meeting with Arif Ahmed, meeting with the Free Speech Union, trying to understand why it is that it's very important to protect free speech on university campuses, not falling into this culture warrior rhetoric of there's a crisis on free speech of people saying hateful things and racist things, and people like Helen Joyce just want to go to various colleges to spread her hateful rhetoric. Even if they just sat down and read Helen Joyce's book, they would understand there's not a shred of hate within it. So what is dispiriting about it is not just that they don't understand, but that they don't want to understand.
And so on that sort of dogmatic attitude that Labour appears to have of just going ahead with this, completely regardless of what the other side thinks, I mean, how much of a concern is that they might use that mindset for other impositions on free speech that are potentially in the pipeline?
Well, it's difficult to say what's coming around the corner. I mean, I've always been an optimist, and I've said, we're not quite heading for the gulags yet. But over the past few months, I've started to become more pessimistic. There is the Labour Party scotching the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill the day before Parliament went into recess, by the way, so they could avoid a debate on it. That's shocking enough. It's an act of political vandalism, as Toby Young has said. They spent years working on this, and it had cross-party support. So this is a fundamentally undemocratic approach to governance. So there's that. There's also the pressure that has been applied to the judiciary to ensure that people are sentenced with draconian jail terms simply for posting memes or unpleasant things on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it might be. That's a real worry as well. I mean, we've seen some real miscarriages of justice going on. Really shocking stuff, I think. So there's all of that. I mean, this week there was a report about a man who now faces 2 years in prison for a shocking Halloween costume, even though the whole point of these Halloween costumes is to have as poor taste as possible. That's the whole idea. So I think we are seeing increasingly, we're also seeing, by the way, the Labour Party wanting to polish up the Online Safety Act to make it even more draconian. It was bad enough as it was. I mean, the Tories did a terrible job with that. So like I say, this is not something, this authoritarian instinct is not about left and right. It's there in both parties. It's there all over the place. But Labour just seems to be completely brazen about it. What with their 412 seats, I suppose they feel they can do whatever the hell they want, but it is frightening. And when you see a democracy like Brazil banning Elon Musk's social media platform outright, threatening to fine people even if they use a VPN to go around the system, that is chilling stuff, because the countries that ban X are China and Iran and North Korea, and now you've got a democracy, relatively recent democracy, but you've got a democracy, Brazil, doing the same thing. This is absolutely terrifying stuff. We've had The Guardian in this country, I think thrice, calling for the arrest of Elon Musk. Jonathan Freeland did it. There was a recent article by Robert Reich in The Guardian that called for his arrest quite explicitly. This is chilling. This is completely baleful and sinister. I mean, I don't understand why people are more concerned about it. The fear is that the Labour government won't stop with the Online Safety Act as they have it reconstructed, but are actually going to call for the ban or even the extradition of the likes of Elon Musk. I don't know. I mean, could it go that far? Potentially. We are dealing with an authoritarian government. I'm not going to go so far as those with Trump derangement syndrome and call them fascist, which is a of course, what some people do. I don't think that's the case. I think they're just fundamentally misguided, ill-informed, and incompetent. And unfortunately, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They might think they're doing something rather wonderful by eliminating what they call hate speech. If they really cared about freedom and the well-being of the citizens, they would be abolishing the very notion of hate speech and encouraging more free speech. We've seen the recent riots in the UK. The groundwork for those riots was, of course, a general sense of resentment and discontent that speech about sensitive issues has not been allowed to go ahead, specifically open discussions about the downsides of unchecked immigration. And instead of saying to themselves, well, we need to maybe open up these discussions so that people feel that they have a voice, they're saying, let's lock people up for draconian jail terms and prevent them from speaking even more. So they're trying to cure the disease with more of the same disease. I am very pessimistic now. I think we have to be really, really watchful, not just in the UK, but around the Western world. We have to stop these authoritarian governments getting in. The way we do that is through the ballot box, of course. But it didn't work this time. Hopefully, next time we can do a bit better.
And I suppose just to end on a slightly lighter note, in the meantime, what are some of the ways that people can safeguard this fundamental bedrock value of free speech?
It's a very good question. I think you have to keep speaking. I think you have to be courageous. I think you have to say whatever you want. And that's easier said than done, of course, because we live in an age of cancel culture when people do lose their jobs. They do get passed over for promotion. They do get harassed and hounded out of work. And there's a lot of work building up for the Free Speech Union at the moment. But we have to hold fast to this fundamental principle, because what is the alternative? The alternative is that we live in a future dystopian state where we are under a tyranny. And you might say that's histrionic, but it's not really. If you look at the grand scheme of history, these instincts have never gone away. The rise of fascism and communism wasn't that long ago. It's within living memory. So if we want to guard against that kind of thing recurring, we have to hold fast and defend and restate the case for free speech as much as we can. In terms of a safety measure, protective measure, joining the Free Speech Union is the obvious thing to do. I think everyone should join the Free Speech Union. It's going to become very, very necessary. But also we need to contact MPs and try to urge them to protect free speech, this most fundamental of democratic liberties, and to keep speaking openly and honestly, and not to be afraid of saying what we think, however unpopular it might be. Like I say, easier said than done. And you were asking for a more optimistic note to end on, and maybe that wasn't that optimistic. But I will say on an optimistic note that if everyone who believes in freedom and liberty, which I think is the vast majority of us, were to live our lives in accordance with those beliefs, to stand by our principles and to be open and courageous, then this threat does go away. What if you leave it to just a few free thinkers here and there who are willing to take the bullets, then we all lose out.
Well, on that note, Andrew Doyle, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Germany is the biggest economy in Europe and the most important player in the EU. And in recent years, its left-leaning political establishment has been aghast at the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. The right-wing populist party has upended the political landscape in Germany by tapping into broad public discontent with the ruling elite, especially over immigration. Now, at recent state elections in East Germany, the AfD has made record gains. So what does this mean for Germany and the bloc more widely? Well, here to answer that is the pseudonymous commentator Eugyppius, regular Sceptic guest and the author of the Substack Eugyppius, A Plague Chronicle. Welcome back to the Sceptic, Eugyppius.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's fantastic to be here.
Okay, so first of all, it seems there's always a lot going on in Germany, but just give us an update of the past few weeks. So there's been these state elections in East Germany, and the AfD seems to have been doing quite well. And so, what's happened there, and what has been the reaction of the German establishment to that?
Yeah, so the event for which the establishment has been quaking for over a year now, since 2023, is the East German elections. This year, Thüringen, Saxony, and Brandenburg elect new state parliaments. They're all in the East, where Alternative für Deutschland are strongest. And there's been enormous establishment anxiety about how well AfD will do in the East, in these Eastern elections. So at the beginning of this month, Thüringen and Saxony had their elections, and Brandenburg will have theirs on Sunday. So, in Thüringen, the AfD did extremely well, despite all of the freakouts about the right wing, all of our anti-fascist marches sponsored by ruling parties, all of the media campaigns against AfD. They still claimed 32.8% of the vote in Thüringen, making the strongest party in the state, and they were second strongest in Saxony, 30.6% of the vote, just behind the CDU, the center-right Christian Democrats, who had 31.9%. They would have also been strongest in Saxony, except a sort of harder right monarchist party, the Free Saxons, Freie Sachsen, also ran in that election as kind of a spoiler party, and AfD lost a few points to them. So they're second place in Saxony, but still very strong. There's a political problem arising from AfD's success, which is particularly acute in Thüringen. Well, it's sort of twofold. First of all, the mainstream cartel parties won't work with AfD, refuse to form coalitions with them because they are extreme right fascists and so forth. But now AfD is so strong in Thüringen that there's no way not to work with them. So they have over a third of the seats in the state parliament. So they get what is called a Sperrminorität, or a blocking minority. So anything the state parliament wants to do that requires 2/3 vote, which is the appointment of certain important judges, revisions to the state constitution, a few other things, the parliament can't do that without agreement from AfD. And so they will have to work with AfD. AfD will be able to demand concessions for their cooperation with these votes. So in many ways, the cordon sanitaire is already in collapse in Thüringen. The other problem in Thüringen is AfD is so strong that the other parties all have a serious problem forming any kind of government there. And we don't really know how they're going to do this. So if we take the center-right CDU, they're in second place, but they only have a little less than 24% of the vote. So they'll have to align with the SPD. But the SPD, the Social Democrats, they are so weak in the East, everyone hates them. So CDU and SPD still have less than a third of the seats in the parliament. So they'll have to go with this new upstart leftist party, which split off from Die Linke. So we have, of course, Die Linke, the left party, which is the rebranded Socialist Unity Party from the DDR. A split off from them is the Alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht. So it's a more sort of old socialist party, but more anti-war, anti-Atlanticist, anti-Ukraine war, also some migration skepticism. So even if the CDU enters a coalition with the Alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht, and there's a lot of disagreement within the party about whether they can go with a hard left party like this. Even if they do that and they enter a coalition with the SPD, the Social Democrats as well, they're still one seat short of a governing majority. So they'll have to also then arrange some kind of agreement of toleration with the left-wing party, with Die Linke, to run a minority government. It's very unclear if that will work or what that will look like. And they'll have to do all of this only to then govern with leftist parties, so govern from the left, even as a center-right party, and further discredit themselves in the East. So there's a lot of different theories about what that will happen, what would look like. The sort of the leading theory, which I also think is correct, is that CDU will jump through all of these hoops. They will go into these coalitions with left-leaning parties, but then they'll quietly cooperate with the AfD informally for votes so they can govern more from the right. Even though they're technically not doing this, they'll secretly arrange votes to approve measures from the right with the AfD, and they'll enter into a kind of sort of secret agreement of cooperation so they don't absolutely destroy themselves electorally.
Okay, so obviously in Britain, we don't have a federal system like you do in Germany. So can you just give us a brief explainer on, well, the significance of these state legislatures and the powers they have?
Yeah, so Germany is at least legally a pretty robust federal system. So obviously matters like national defense or other things are managed by the federal government, but otherwise the regional governments are pretty powerful. Federalism in Germany is fairly robust. I would say at least technically as robust as it is in the United States. De facto, it's been undermined because Germany wants to behave like a more centralized nation state. So, for example, during COVID, what we see is that the different regional governments of the German states informally agree to adopt all the same policies all at once. So there's not any variation. But as we see, the East Germany begins to drift, develops its own politics, begins to drift more and more from West German politics. I think this kind of informal agreements via which German federalism is undermined, will be harder to sustain, and East Germany will begin to look somewhat increasingly different from how West Germany functions. It's important also to add, I meant to say, AfD is also leading in Brandenburg. So in Thüringen and Saxony, in Saxony especially, but also in Thüringen, CDU has been, the center-right party, has been a very dominant party. And AfD is sort of beginning to replace them. And I think we can say in the next 5-10 years, AfD will really be the new CDU in both states. CDU will then be a more minor party. But interesting in Brandenburg is that AfD is replacing not CDU. In Brandenburg, the Social Democrats are always the dominant party. So Brandenburg, always social democratic state. In the 90s, SPD ruled there with an outright majority, very unusual in Germany. And AfD is replacing SPD in Brandenburg. So we see it's a very versatile party capable of taking votes from different establishment parties depending on where they're at. So that's also a good sign.
Okay, so obviously with the rise of the AfD and the establishment freak out over it, that's really raising the salience of immigration politics in Germany. But there's also been this other event that even made headlines over here, which is this horrible attack on this so-called Festival of Diversity at Solingen. That happened, and that was shortly before the election, I think. And so, how are both of those changing the politics of migration in Germany?
Yeah, so Solingen happened right before the East German elections in Thüringen and Saxony, and it sort of served to make migration the salient issue going into the election. And right now, the federal governments in Berlin, they have been for a long time extremely unpopular. And I think they are perhaps the most unpopular sitting government in post-war German history. They are absolutely hated. Government parties are losing elections in the East. So all of this has caused the federal government to try to appear that they're doing something about the migration. The central flashpoint of the Solingen stabbing, this Islamist Syrian killed 3 people at this diversity festival, as you say, was that he was supposed to have been deported to Bulgaria. According to the Dublin system, you're supposed to claim asylum where you first enter European Union soil, and he had entered through Bulgaria some years ago, and he was supposed to be returned, but he simply didn't answer his door when they came to deport him, and German police didn't care, and so he was allowed to stay. And this has made this whole issue of the Dublin system and its dysfunctionality very, very salient, high issue in German politics, and it's created a lot of demand. Clear majorities across all parties, including the Greens, by the way. 55% of Greens want more migration restriction, want an insistence on Dublin rules. So Germany doesn't really have any borders on the outside of the EU. So if you insist on the Dublin system, then almost all asylees need to leave Germany and find asylum elsewhere. So the government right now has been in negotiations with the opposition, the parliamentary opposition, the Christian Democrats, to try to come up with some sort of accord and a way to enhance border security. So the government preemptively, the Interior Ministry said that they will enact spot border checks across all German national borders. Now, this is largely symbolic. It's not going to do a lot, but it's very significant because they said before this was impossible. It would strain the resources of the police. It wouldn't do anything anyway. And now they're saying the opposite. Oh, we can certainly do this. We'll turn away loads of asylees this way. Just turned the rhetoric overnight. So that's one thing. And second thing is the CDU has become extremely demanding, and now that they want not only these spot border checks, but they want sort of strict enforcement of the Dublin system on all German national borders. So rejection of all asylees who have passed through another secure country to Germany, turn away back to their first secure country. And there's now really unprecedented since 2015, a massive debate about whether this is possible, the degree to which such a thing could be enforced, is legally realizable, and so forth. And the debate is very interesting because a lot of sort of the myths we've been told about migration for the last 9 years are now just bluntly discarded by all parties everywhere. So we can say, actually, migrants aren't so great. Actually, they're super expensive and we can't afford them. Actually, it seems like it ought to be theoretically possible to turn them away. All these things now are just admitted by all the parties at once. It's very surprising change in the discourse.
Okay, and so but obviously there are a lot of EU-wide policies with respect to immigration. So you mentioned the Dublin system, there's obviously the Schengen area as well, and then Frontex, so the EU border force. And that might lead you to think that migration generally as a policy would more be determined at the EU level. And yet what you're saying in your article is that actually what happens at the nation state level is very significant, and that there could be this dynamic that I think you call a race to the bottom on migration. started by a given nation state, namely probably Germany. What can you just explain that dynamic?
Yeah, so this idea has been around for a while. Various immigration experts have been bringing this up now for a few years. As you say, EU has basically arrogated to itself migration policy for the entire European Union zone, but national border policies, they're very significant for the maintenance of all of these international migration systems and all the jurisprudence surrounding them. Basically, because Europe is a continent full of very generous social welfare states, migration to European countries is very burdensome economically and also to some degree legally. If countries are overburdened by migration, they will begin to ignore these international agreements and enforce their own border security, one. And then two, they will also seek to disincentivize migrants. So we see this already happened in Hungary, Denmark especially. These two countries demonstrate that you can pretty much drive asylum applicants almost to zero just by making benefits unattractive, by having an unwelcoming society. You don't even have to do a lot of border policing to achieve this. Denmark especially shows this is true. Now, what happens, it's okay if Denmark or Hungary do this because they're both relatively small countries. So Denmark stops taking its share of migrants. The migration pressure on the rest of Europe is not really meaningfully or noticeably increased. The danger is if a large dominant EU country like Germany or France ceases to do the same thing, because then all the migrants that this major country would receive would then go to other countries. They would then be burdened substantially more, and they would themselves then be motivated to disincentivize migration, close the borders, and so forth. So this is a chain reaction, a race to the bottom that could happen, that likely will happen if a major European country ever decides to comprehensively disincentivize migration. And so my general theory is that a lot of migration discourse in Germany especially is designed to protect the EU. And if you listen to how our politicians discuss migration, any discussion of migration restriction is answered with, oh, well, you're just anti-European Union. You're just trying to destroy our economic arrangements. You're going to destroy the EU. This would be a disaster for Germany. The idea is that if we start restricting migration, then we'll set off this chain reaction. Other countries will begin to bypass the EU and the entire international jurisprudence around this and close their own borders. Schengen will be over with, the EU will be discredited, and it will be sort of a disaster. So Germany, our German party cartel system, our elites want to keep Germany absorbing migration in order to keep the EU system limping along until they can achieve their own ability to manage border security. But in my opinion, they are congenitally incapable of doing this. They're not going to be able to manage border security in the way countries can. And so, that's basically my idea.
Right, yeah. I mean, it sounds like Germany is almost the bottom of a house of cards here. Okay, so things are shifting in Germany. And you mentioned that smaller countries like Denmark and Hungary have had quite restrictive policies on immigration for some time. And now things are changing as well. I think you mentioned it in the Netherlands and in Sweden. And so how are migration politics across Europe now beginning to change more widely?
Yeah, so it has changed, I would say. Across all European countries, we see the rise of different populist, right-leaning parties. So of course, France, Italy. In many ways, Germany is an exception and not in sort of West Germany, at least, tries not to embrace these trends as much. But all of our neighbors are going in this direction. The Netherlands, as you mentioned, has basically just earlier this week promised to do the same thing the CDU are demanding that we do in Germany. So their own allegedly extreme right government said that they will declare a state of emergency and reject asylees at the border according to the Dublin system. So pretty much what the CDU wants to do in Germany, Netherlands took the initiative and said, oh, we'll do the same thing. So we see if they're able to do that. It's a little bit legally uncertain, but we see that there's a general trend and discussion. So yeah, as you say, Sweden also, the mood has shifted, but I think concrete measures to limit migration are still some ways off. But at least the mood has shifted and the discussion has shifted enough that I think we're now at the point where migration, open borders policies have become just very difficult to justify. They've admitted that all the old arguments made in 2015 aren't really right anymore, and mass migration just doesn't make sense in the current discourse that we have. It's very hard to justify. And if you look at how the pro-migration parties discuss migration, they're now just appeals to liberalism and to a common humanity. They've abandoned all of their technocratic arguments about how we can do this. Even the legal arguments, it's illegal to close borders or human, all of that stuff is really very attenuated now. And I really think it's a general sort of ideological system that is in decay or collapse even. So that is some reason for optimism.
Right. And so the pro-migration consensus in the EU had seemed very entrenched. And I think, in fact, as you've argued, that it was almost seemed so entrenched that it was impossible to reverse for a number of reasons. And yet now it very much does seem to be changing. So what's your theory of how that has, that sort of tidal shift has been able to take place?
So basically, the widespread immigration to Europe has caused politics to shift towards in a sort of populist, unmanaged direction. Perhaps you call them right-wing parties. I think that's it's not really true. I think even parties like the AfD, there are right-wing currents in them, but they're above all sort of populist. They have sort of an anti-elite element. They're reacting to the failure of elite projects and so forth. And we see the same politics everywhere. The rise of these right-wing populist parties is really a direct reaction to mass migration, and it has made the existing political establishment of Europe, it has made it much harder for this establishment to win elections, to form coalition governments, and to continue with politics as they were before. And so, while you're totally right, there's this massive migration machinery. A big myth about migration is it just happens to us and so forth. But actually, there's a lot of sea rescue NGOs, entire jurisprudence, all kinds of different actors working to keep the borders open. This has a lot of momentum behind it, but it's suddenly very unpalatable to the political establishment because it's just destroying their position electorally. And I think this is increasingly clear to them. So they're not, of course, reacting to the negative effects of mass migration directly. They're reacting to their own decaying political position. I think that they approach these things in a very cynical way. But at the same time, it doesn't really matter how sincere they are. The will and the energy for open borders and mass migration has all but evaporated in Germany. I would say even across the left. It's just the polling on this is very incredible. How you see, I thought the Greens would be in favor of open borders for the rest of my life. When you see solid majorities of even the Green Party against migration, it's a really strong signal.
And so, I mean, how interesting is it to think about this as kind of a function of democracy here? I mean, of course, the establishment freak out over the AfD, will often claim that it is itself a threat to democracy. But then, people on the other side will say, oh, well, the elites, they always betray their voters. People never get what they want in immigration. And it just goes on and on and on. But what seems to have happened here is, well, people cared about this issue. It raised in salience. A party campaigned on it, and now the elites are having to respond to that.
Yeah, it's surprising. So I think I've always been very pessimistic about possibilities of democracy and the degree to which popular sovereignty is real in any way. But it's also true that there's a limit to how much the elite system, the media system, messaging and so forth can manage public opinion. When public opinion shifts very hard in a certain direction, there's not much they can do. They sooner or later have to accommodate it or lose control of the state apparatus because they won't be able to maintain elected office any longer. Or I suppose they could, institute some sort of coup and refuse to obey election results or something. But I think that's sort of impossible for liberal democracies in the West, at least. So it's a real force. And now that they are unable to manage public opinion anymore via all of their messaging strategies, they are reluctantly giving ground. It is a real sort of bottom-up movement. I think it's very clear.
Yeah, okay. And so finally, there was this question at the end of your piece about how sincere this is. Now, obviously, there's an incentive for parties like the CDU to show that they're responding to demand and by taking a hard line on immigration here. But if they're only doing that, not very sincerely, they don't really believe in this, then how sustainable will this sort of tide shift actually be?
Yeah, that's an important question. So when we talk about CDU, we should never forget that they are the party that did this to Germany in the first place. So mass migration was increasing before 2015, but it was really Angela Merkel, CDU, with her constant leftist triangulations, her self-promotional triangulation strategies that caused the massive Wir schaffen das migration wave in 2015 and 2016. And really, it's a direct line from there to here. So the CDU did this, and now, of course, they're trying to undo their legacy in ways that they're not directly repudiating Merkel, but they're trying to distance themselves from that past in ways that are more or less unconvincing. And so, I agree they're not sincere, they're very cynical, they're responding to electoral pressures, and they're also responding to an opportunity to stick the knife into the regime parties, the coalition government, their old enemies in the SPD and so forth. They're using this to destroy the present government. And so when they're in charge, will they just enter a coalition with the Greens and open the borders again? Anything's possible. But I think what's really happened with this discursive shift is that the entire mythology about mass migration has been largely destroyed. And this has been happening slowly in Germany, but really the progress we've made in the past even 4 weeks has been incredible. So as I said, the whole myth that borders are uncontrollable, that migration just happens and you have to adapt, that's been sort of rejected by all parties, including the CDU. Now everyone admits this is ridiculous. The idea that we have infinite resources, that we can do that, as Merkel said, that's gone. Everyone agrees we can't, that it's too expensive, that it's, all these things are gone. The idea that refugees are an asset, that they diversify our society, that they improve everything. We just had the sitting interior minister of the SPD write a letter to the EU Commission saying that the refugees in Germany have contributed to a sense of a loss of public security. These kinds of direct equations of refugees with insecurity, with terrorist attacks and so forth. We've never had this before. So on down the list, the entire diversity myth, the uncontrollable borders myth have been destroyed by the parties and repudiated by basically everyone in the establishment in the past month. So I don't see how you put this back in the bottle. They've created a system, a discursive world, a new consensus reality in which migration is very hard to justify. And even though I totally agree, they're opportunists. They don't care. They've created a new world of discussion around migration that makes mass migration indefensible. And I think that will have a long-lasting effect on policy for the future, whatever their future motivations or movements or more tactical arrangements will be.
Okay, well, Eugyppius, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you so much for invitations. Always a pleasure.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.